ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. My dear brothers and sisters, in the summer heat of the year 1071, so approximately 1,000 years ago, there was a battle taking place in the eastern part of Turkey, which would change the course of history. It would change the shape of history as we know it. So in this eastern part of Turkey, the Seljuk Turks, they were a group that were from Central Asia. The Seljuk Turks had been building an empire that was controlling all of Southwest Asia. So now these Seljuk Turks were taking place in a battle. They were engaged in a battle with who? The Byzantine Empire at the time. Who can tell me here? Just in a single sentence, what is the Byzantine Empire? How do you define the Byzantine Empire? Who knows? Just one sentence. What is the Byzantine Empire? Anyone? Don't be shy, go ahead. The eastern half of the Roman Empire. So you read about in school this great big Roman Empire. By this year, by this time, the Roman Empire now was only left with the eastern part. So that's the Byzantine Empire. Now these Seljuk Turks were engaged in this battle with the Byzantine Empire in Southwest Asia, or the eastern part of Turkey. It turns out that the Seljuk Turks, they had a decisive victory. And now Turkey was under their control, all of Turkey. What this did was that it allowed for all different Turkish tribes that were in Asia to come and settle into the parts of Turkey. So now colonization started by the Turks into that part. They started mixing with the native people over there. They started intermarrying. They started having kids. And now this dynasty of the Turks, it started to expand. This process continued, where the Turks slowly started to defeat the Byzantine Empire one by one. And then, in the year 1258, a legendary man was born. A legendary man by the name of Osman Ghazi. Now, Osman Ghazi was born in the same year that Baghdad was conquered by the Mongols. And I think last week you probably learned about this, how the Mongols invaded Baghdad and just crushed it to pieces. They killed everybody. The blood ran so much that it filled basically the rivers. Libraries were burned down. Baghdad was completely destroyed. So this man was born in the same year. And it turns out that this encounter with the Mongols, that the Mongols were having with the Muslims, shaped his history and shaped his character as well. So now Osman Ghazi, he was basically on the borders of the Byzantine Empire, where he stood. So he was raised as a warrior since he was a little kid. Since he was a little kid, he was put into the path of war and how to be a noble warrior and basically protecting Islam from foreign invaders. That was his life. That was his teaching. From a young age, he was a strong young man, engaged in being very strong, very athletic, and knowing that the fight of the Muslims is in defending the Muslims from foreign invasions. That was his entire life. Now, a few years pass, and Osman Ghazi, he has a dream. He has a dream that there's a tree that is growing out of his chest. The roots and branches of that tree are going to Europe, Asia, and Africa. So he goes to his alim, he goes to the sheikh, and he asks for the interpretation of this dream. The sheikh tells him that the interpretation of this dream is that your descendants, the people that come from you, are going to control Europe and Asia and Africa later on in history. So at this point, this was just a dream. This was just a vision that Osman Ghazi was having. Now it turns out that since the Mongols were wreaking havoc on the other parts of the Muslim world, they were basically refugees that were fleeing to come and take refuge with the Turks. So now the refugees that are being persecuted by the Mongols are coming and joining the ranks of Osman Ghazi so that they can seek refuge. Now Osman Ghazi is being strengthened by these influx of refugees. He himself is a very strong man, and he has a great military force that is with him. And now the refugees are coming, so his military strength is growing. So now he starts to push on the Byzantine borders more and more and more. And over the course of the next 100 years, he set the foundations for something. That over the next 100 years, the Byzantine Empire, one by one fell, and by the 1300s, by the early 1300s, the Byzantine Empire as we know it was almost officially over. Almost all of it was conquered by these Turks. And the foundations of it were set with Osman Ghazi. Now keep in mind the vision that he had, that he would control Europe and Asia and Africa. He had this dream, right? Well, it turns out that now, at this point in history, in the early 1300s, he now controls a good part of the Byzantine Empire and many of the parts of Asia as well. So he has control over this whole region, or his descendants have control over this whole region. His sons, they continued on. His sons and his grandsons, they continued on in this tradition to basically conquer and expand their territory all across Europe and Asia. Osman passed away in 1326. Now, when he passed away, he gave a very beautiful speech to his son. And this speech, it tells us what kind of a man he was. Because so far, we're looking at him as a man who's only concerned with war and conquering territories. But we'll see the roots of his intentions, what his true intentions were. When he was dying, this is what he told his son. He said, "My son, I don't feel sad over me fast approaching death, for a worthy son like you is going to succeed me." And then he says, "Make it a point not to give up devotion to Allah the Almighty. Make it a point not to ever give up your devotion to Allah the Almighty, and to have taqwa, and to have rahmah, to have mercy, and to rule with justice." So this is the advice that he's giving his son. And then he says, "Your first and foremost duty, son, your first and foremost duty is to establish the codes of Sharia, is to establish the Islamic law in the lands, and never forget that duty." And then he goes on to say, do not give religious duties to careless, faithless, and sinful men. And do not also give administrative affairs. Do not let them have any part in the state's affairs, and do not let them have any part in the religious affairs. Men that are sinful and that are indifferent, that aren't very religious. And he says, because the one without fear of God, the one without fear of God will have no fear of the creation. If a person does not fear God, how is he going to fear the creation? And then he says, one who commits a great sin and continues to sin can never be loyal. Can never be loyal. Let's pause for a minute. Let's think about this profound statement of Osman Ghazi, right at his moments of death, this legendary figure. By the way, the Ottoman Empire. The word Ottoman actually is the name of Osman. It's a Latin corruption. It's a corruption of the name of Osman that in Latin is basically called Ottoman. But really the name Ottoman Empire comes from this great and legendary man, Osman Ghazi. Now, this statement of his, that the one who commits a great sin can never be loyal. What does that mean? What it means is that if a person cannot be loyal to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if a person, knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching him and he does not care, if a person, knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most severe in punishment, and he does not care, such a person, if he can betray his Rabb, if he can betray his Lord, how is he ever going to remain loyal to a person in this dunya? If he can betray his Rabb and betray his Lord. Such a person has no hayat. He has no concern that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching and controlling everything that he does. So how can he ever be loyal? It's a betrayal to Allah. That person will surely betray the creation. So he's giving a very useful advice that, look, if you see men that are sinful, openly engaged in sin, do not put them in positions of authority, do not put them in religious duties. And this is something today, wallahi, in our times today, this has utterly changed, because one of the signs of the Day of Judgment, unfortunately, one of the signs of the Day of Judgment is that people will elect leaders and rulers that are not fit to rule over them. They will elect people that are unreligious. They will elect leaders that are unreligious, that are not qualified, and they will put them in positions of power. And we see this sign today. One of the signs of the Day of Judgment today we see occurring. That our leaders, unfortunately, are incompetent. They're unqualified to lead, and they're also unqualified as religious men. Many of our leaders today in the Muslim world, unfortunately. So now Osman Ghazi, he gives this advice to his son. The reality of the issue is, dear brothers and sisters, that the great sins a lot of us look at it as being things such as drinking and hooking up with hooking up with girls and guys and so on and so forth, going out, stealing, murdering. But did you know that one of the deadly major sins that can throw a person by their face into the hellfire, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not even look twice at the person. One of the major deadly sins is what? Uquq al-walidain. The disobedience of the parents. The disobedience of the parents is actually one of the major deadly, one of the worst sins that a person can commit, right up there with shirk towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and all of the other sins like murder and committing zina and so on and so forth. Now this disobedience, we're not talking about simple disobedience, we're talking about disobedience that makes your parents very angry or it makes them cry. Ibn Umar, he said that the pleasure of the Lord, that the pleasure of Allah is with the pleasure of the parents. And the displeasure of Allah is with the displeasure of the parents. A man came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he said, to whom do I give most of my company to? In other words, what he's asking is, who should I be very beautiful towards? Who should I be who should I honor the most? Rasulullah said, your mother. So he asked again, then who? Rasulullah said, your mother. He asked again, then who? Rasulullah said, your mother. And then he asked after that, who? And then Rasulullah said, your father. In another instance, a man came to Ibn Umar, and he asked him that, I've committed such and such sins, what should I do? Ibn Umar said to him, do you really wish to avoid the fire? Do you really wish to not enter the fire? And do you really want to enter Jannah? The man said, yes, by Allah, of course I do. He said, are your parents alive? The man said, my mother is. He said, then go to her and speak gently to her and feed her, and you will enter Jannah as long as you stay away from the major sins. Now when he's saying speak gently to her and feed her, what he means by feeding her, feeding your mother, not to literally feed your mother, that's if she reaches old age, what it means is taking care of her needs. If she asks you to do something, if she needs you to do something, if she wants you to be beautiful to her, then go and serve her needs. So anyways, just a small tangent, I just wanted to kind of bring this to our attention, that the kaba'ir, the major sins, one of them is the uquq al-walidain, the major disobedience of the parents. So Osman Ghazi, he gave this advice to his son. And then his son takes over and carries the tradition of expanding his empire. Let's fast forward now. The next 100 years or so were marked with great expansion of their territory. By the end of the 1300s, most of the Byzantine Empire, as I mentioned, and large parts of Asia were under this Turkish control, were under the control of the descendants of Osman Ghazi. Then, in the year 1400, a sultan came who rose to the ranks of being an emperor by the name of Sultan Muhammad I. Now he came at a time when the Ottoman dynasty was now at a decline. The Mongols, the ones that had some of the Mongol tribes and the Mughal tribes and the ones that had accepted Islam at the time, they were now fighting against the Turks for control. So now Muslims are fighting Muslims. And in the early 1400s, the Ottoman dynasty faced a great threat. They had suffered a great defeat at the hands of the Mongols, at the hands of these other tribes, Muslim tribes. And now this dynasty, this empire was starting to fall apart. Sultan Muhammad I came, and he fought. Think about this for a second. He fought with his own brothers. He had 8 brothers or so. He fought with his brothers for almost 11 years before he could bring power to his grip. So the brothers are now warring against each other for who's going to be the king, who's going to take over the dynasty. So he had to fight against his own brothers, unfortunately. He had no choice because his brothers were fighting him. And he came to power. He was able to crush all the rebellion and come to power. Now when Sultan Muhammad I came to power, the scholars say that he is the Nuh of the Ummah, of the Ottoman Ummah. He was like Nuh alayhi salam of the Ottoman Ummah. Why? Because he was able to save a dying dynasty through his soft policy. For his own people, he had a very soft policy. He didn't impose very strict laws and strict rules over them. He was very soft. He was very wise in his decision making. And through this, he was able to revive the Ottoman dynasty once again and take control of the entire region that they once had control over. So in the 1400s, the Ottoman dynasty could have officially ended, but Sultan Muhammad I came and he revived the Ummah. He revived the Ottoman dynasty and kept it stable, kept it in its right path. He was the first Ottoman king, Sultan Muhammad I. And this shows you that the Ottomans were actually the leaders of the Muslim world. He was the first Ottoman king to fix an annual grant for the Kaaba, for the maintenance of the Kaaba and the maintenance of the Haram, and he would send money for the poor and needy people of Makkah. So here, once again, it shows you that these men were actually religious. They had a sense of honor. Even though he was in parts of Asia, he would send money for the maintenance of the Kaaba and of the Masjid al-Haram and of the poor and needy Makkans. After him, the dynasty, the Ottoman dynasty, was stabilized. It was kept stable. Then, about 20 or 30 years after that, Sultan Muhammad II came. We just talked about Sultan Muhammad I. Sultan Muhammad II came, and once again, the history books would be changed forever. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the Arabian desert, people who had no kind of real technology, they had no real military strength. They had really nothing to compare with the likes of Rome and Persia at the time. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in that desert Arabian heat, he said that we will one day conquer Constantinople. We will one day conquer modern-day Istanbul, which was at the time people were looking at amazement. How is this going to happen? This is impossible. How are we, the Arabs? We have no kind of technology, no military might. We barely even have numbers to fight. How are we going to go and take on the Romans and Persians and take down Constantinople, take down Istanbul? But Rasulullah made this promise. Sultan Muhammad II at this time, which is about the mid-1400s, he said that I want to fulfill this vision of Rasulullah. Many kings and emperors before that had tried, but they had failed. The Abbasids had tried, but they weren't able to fully conquer Constantinople or modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. So Muhammad II, now, at this time in history, he controls many parts of Europe and Asia, okay? So I just want you to visualize for a second. Here you have Constantinople, and now the Ottomans are literally surrounding it from all different angles. So what he does is that he orders for a fortress to be built, a fortress on the north of Constantinople, so he could send ships back and forth. And the fortress he had constructed in the name of Muhammad. So literally, if you viewed it from the top, you would see the fortress spelling out Muhammad. Because he said that I will fulfill his destiny and I will fulfill his vision. So he had this fortress built. And on April 1st, 1453, so our mid-1400s, he sent about 100,000 soldiers to the shore of Constantinople to lay a siege and to lay an attack on the city. Now, you know what they saw in front of them when they reached? They saw these thick walls, layers of walls. Constantinople was known for defending themselves with walls after walls after walls. So not just a single wall like most cities had. They had multiple layers of walls. That's what they saw in front of them. And then they saw the Golden Horn. The Golden Horn was basically a little piece of water where you could get access to the city. But what the people had done is that they had put a big iron chain in that Golden Horn so that ships could not pass through. So now the Muslims are they're seeing these walls, and they're seeing that the body of water is covered with this big iron chain. But regardless, they pressed forward, and they started to attack the city with cannons from the outside. But it turns out that the city was strong. Constantinople was very strong, very prideful. They had a good military. They held off for weeks. For weeks, they laid siege on the city. Now, Sultan Muhammad II, also known as Mehmed in Turkish, sometimes he's called Mehmed, he said that enough of this. We're going to carry our ships. We're going to get men to literally carry our ships on our shoulders and take them into the Golden Horn so that we can get into the north part of the city. So you know that chain that was in the body of water? People literally carried the ships from land and got into the city by carrying ships and putting it into the water. You know, men that were carrying it on their shoulders. So now he was able to get access to the city, and he once again started his attack. And it turns out that now the Muslims were starting to be started to look like that they were going to succeed and they were going to be the victors. So on April 28th, he had everybody stop. He had the whole army stop, and he said that today, we're going to spend the day in the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Today, we're going to make dua to Allah, we're going to pray to Allah, and we're not going to do any fighting as a means of thankfulness to Allah, and as a means to give us the righteousness and the taqwa for when we invade the city that we do the right thing. So the whole Dim and his army, they spent in prayer and making dua, and asking Allah for victory, and thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for how far they had come. The next day, they laid siege on the city. They went into the city, and the city it basically crumbled. It fell right into their hands. Now, you know what's notable about Sultan Muhammad II after he gained victory over the city? He said that none of the residents are to be killed. None of the residents are to be killed. He pardoned all the residents. And then he said that all the residents of the city, they're absolved from taxes. You don't have to pay tax. You stay under my rule. And then he said that the Greek patriarch, the religious leader at the time, he said that I want you to stay and I want you to rule the city on my behalf. So he gave the Christians the authority to rule over themselves. And in that manner, he gained the favor of the people of the city, and he established justice in that land, and the people were free to basically practice their religion. The Christians, the minorities, were free to practice their religion, and this was unprecedented in the history before he had done this. At that time, in contrast, the Christian conquerors, when they were coming to a land, they would destroy all the people. They would go through a process of ethnic cleansing. They would force conversions upon people. But Muhammad II, when he entered into Constantinople, he said, the people are pardoned, you don't have to pay taxes, and you live according to your means. You live according to your same religious laws and same religious duties. So this was the era, the way that the Muslims treated the other religious minorities. The way that the Ottomans treated the other religious minorities was with justice. And they allowed them to have their own systems. They allowed them to practice their cultures and practice their religions freely. This was the precedent set by the Muslims first, before the European world even caught on to this concept of religious equality and this concept of not discriminating against other minorities and religions. Long before the Muslims had already established that. Now, just a few notes on the character and the virtue of this Sultan Muhammad II. His rule was basically packed with all types of conquests, including Constantinople. More than 200 cities were basically he had conquered and he brought under his rule. You would expect that such a great military general wouldn't be a good lawmaker. But in fact, he was one of the best lawmakers. The laws that he made eliminated corruption from his administration and his offices. So he instituted laws to basically end corruption from all aspects of his society and all aspects of his government. In addition to that, subhanAllah, he was a great scholar. He was a scholar in the Quran and Hadith. But not only that, he had mastered math and physics as well. So one of the things that he did was that in every city, town, and village that he controlled, he had a madrasa built. He had a religious school built, a madrasa, and he actually developed the curriculum himself. He was so smart and so intelligent that he actually wrote the curriculum from the Quran to the Hadith, to math, to physics, to language, to literature, and all of these things to basically enhance and improve the education of the Muslims. He also instituted that first and foremost, under my rule, the Quran will rule first. And then after that, the Hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then after that, we will look to the 4 Imams, the 4 madhabs of fiqh. And then after that, we're free to make our laws and to choose our laws, as long as they don't contradict with the Islamic sources. He was the first to fully implement this, that this is the process that we're going to follow in making laws. He was a man that had a lot of prestige. He didn't really mix with the common people, but with the soldiers, he would be in the front lines of the battle, and his soldiers described him as an affectionate father, a loving, touching, affectionate father who was very close to his first-rate soldiers. So whether they were advanced or whether they were low, it didn't matter. They all considered him like an affectionate father. He also, put out a lot of cruel punishments for people that committed wrong actions, but he also rewarded the people that did good actions. So he had to balance. People who were good, even if they did a little bit of good, he gave them immense rewards. And people who committed wrong, he instituted cruel punishments, really cruel punishments. But you know what came out of that? During his time, there was no uprisings, no revolts, and corruption from the administration or from the government had almost disappeared, had almost vanished, as a result of his wisdom and the way he carried out his policies. After him, the next sultan that came. Let's fast forward again another 60, 70 years. There were many sultans that came in between, but none of them were of any importance. The next one that came was Sultan Selim in 1512. So now we're approaching the climax of the Ottoman Empire. It's continuing to build, it's continuing to rise. In 1512, Sultan Selim comes to power. He only ruled for about 8 years, but in those 8 years, he did more than what other sultans could have done in 20, 30, 40, even 50 years. He was an amazing conqueror, a marvelous conqueror. The thing about Sultan Selim was that he was a very, very angry man, unfortunately. One of the bad parts of his character was that he would issue death sentences like it was nothing. The scholars say that he was a religious man. He was a religious man. He had a sense of religious honor. But on the other hand, he was also very, very cruel in punishment. But you know, even though he was cruel in punishment with the people, he held religious scholars in great regard and great esteem. He never argued or touched, he never instituted punishments on scholars. He only did it for the regular people. A couple of stories that kind of give you a feel for how Sultan Selim, how angry of a man he really was. One time, some of the officials of his finance department, they took some action that he wasn't pleased with, that he wasn't happy with. So he issued death sentences for all of them. He said that, you know what, I don't like the way you're carrying out stuff. All of you are going to be killed, heads chopped off. The Qadi at the time, Qadi is basically a religious scholar or a religious judge. The Qadi at the time, when he finds out that Sultan Selim had issued this decree to kill off all of his finance ministers, he came and he interceded with them on behalf of them. And he said that, you know what? You are taking care, you're trying to manage the affairs of this dunya, but I'm concerned about your akhirah. I'm concerned about your hereafter. That's what the Qadi said to Sultan Selim. And he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows pity to those, shows mercy to those who show pity to others, and Allah will chastise, will punish those who are cruel. So Sultan Selim, after hearing this advice from this religious scholar, he took it and he abolished the sentence. He said that, you know what, I'm not going to carry out the sentence. So it shows that even though he had flaws, he had mistakes, he wasn't perfect, but at the same time, when a religious scholar approached him, he had a great deal of respect. In another story, another instance, he issued an order that nobody's going to transport silk, nobody's going to trade silk to Iran. They were basically at war with the state of Iran at the time. So he said that no more transporting of silk. Well, he got news that some traders were still taking silk to Iran. So you know what he did? Yes. He said, kill all those traders. Whoever's transporting the silk to Iran, gather them, chop their heads off. Again, the Qadi at the time, he approaches Sultan Selim, and he says that, you know what, I don't think that you should do so because the court order had not reached them. They did not even know because they weren't able to learn about the court order that you're given, that no trade should be done of silk to Iran. So the Sultan Selim, he gets angry, and he says that, you know what, please don't interfere with my administrative affairs. Please don't interfere. The Qadi got extremely angry at him. The religious scholar got extremely angry. He got up and he left, which was a sign of disrespect. At the time, you didn't do this to the Sultan. You did not just get up and walk away without seeking his permission. There was always some type of honor that you give. But the Qadi, the religious scholar, he's not afraid of him. So he gets up and he walks away in a sign of disrespect. Sultan Selim, he puts his head down, he thinks for a few minutes, and then he raises his head and he says that, you know what, pardon all of those traitors, I'm not going to carry out this sentence. And then he sent a message to that Qadi, and he said that I want to make you the official mufti, the official judge of the entire empire. And the Qadi declined. He said that I don't want to take any part in this. How much time do I have? Okay, so, there's a lot of information. There's a lot of different things that we need to cover, but since we're running out of time, let me just get right into the fall, or the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Selim, after him came his son Sultan Suleiman, who also, basically expanded the territories of the Ottomans, and then they had reached their climax. Ibn Khaldun, a great historian, he says that every nation has a lifespan like human beings. As human beings live and die, nations also live and die. So now that the Ottoman Empire had reached its peak, now the decline of the Ottoman Empire started. And let's look at some of the reasons for the decline. The first reason was that there was a decline in their government structure. See, the problem with the Ottoman Empire was that they didn't have an official way of choosing successors. They didn't have an official way, so a king, before he died, he would just choose one of the sons. What would happen is that the sons would fight against each other sometimes. And this would go on for years and years and years. So in about the year 1600s, Sultan Ahmed I, he comes, and he tries to do something which was really unwise. He says that, you know what, I'm going to keep all my sons in the palace of Istanbul until I'm ready to pass away. So basically, he wanted to keep his sons in the palace as prisoners until he's ready to pass away, and then he chooses one of them to take the lead. Now, as you can imagine, what happened when he did this? The sons were completely incompetent. They had no kind of experience in dealing with state affairs. They had no experience in military expeditions. So when the sons in the 1600s started to come to power, they were very, very prone to taking bribery. They were prone to showing favoritism. The officials that they would elect were unqualified because they themselves were unqualified. So here, the government structure now started to collapse. Incompetent people started to come to power. And this was one of the reasons that the Ottoman Empire started to decline. The other reason was economic. Since the Ottoman Empire had reached its peak, it had conquered so much territory. We're talking about North Africa, Europe, Asia, just like the dream of Osman Ghazi. Just like the dream of Osman Ghazi, the Ottoman Empire was now controlling all of those regions. Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Big chunks in those parts. What happened now was that they stopped expanding. And the war booty, the spoils of war, started to dry up. So now with the lack of revenue, what happened next was that there was an influx of gold and silver into the Ottoman society. An influx of gold and silver. From where? From basically Mexico and from the New World that was being conquered. There was a lot of gold and silver that the French and the Spanish and the English were gathering up. So what that did was that it caused inflation into the Ottoman society. Now, just a quick analogy of how inflation works. These t-shirts that we're passing out, there's only one of them, right? Let's say that I started giving a t-shirt out to every one of you. What would be the value of those t-shirts now? Would anybody even care? Would anybody even fight for winning one of those t-shirts? Probably not. If iPads were given to everybody who came through the door, it would become next to nothing. So in the same way, there was so much gold and silver pouring into the economy that inflation rose in the Ottoman times, and prices really went up with the goods. So now, with them losing this economic power, what they did was that they started to negotiate with the other nations, with the European nations, and started making concessions with them. Concessions such as, you take over an entire industry. For example, you take over clothes making industry, and we'll just pay you, you just have to pay us a one-time payment, and you can take over entire industries. They were so desperate for money that they were handing out entire markets and entire industries within their empire to the French, usually the French, in exchange for a one-time payment. In exchange for a one-time payment. And this further weakened their economy, and the economy started to crumble. On top of that, they started giving the French full jurisdiction over their citizens. So anywhere there were French citizens inside the Ottoman Empire, they gave the French full control. That you can rule them as you want, you can give them whatever laws that you want. What happened now is that the Ottomans were even losing power of lawmaking and enforcing their laws within their own empire. And they were starting to crumble, and they were in a position of humiliation and subservience. They were below the other nations, the European nations. And they were called officially at that time, they were known in the world as the sick man of Europe. They were literally called the sick man of Europe. Religiously, the Ottomans were declining. As we know, the leaders that were coming to power were so attached to the dunya, were so attached to the worldly life, were so attached to being in palaces that they started to, not really practice their religion the way that their forefathers did. On top of that, there was a wave of European thought, of colonial thought, mostly coming from the French Revolution, that separation of church and state. If you separate religious affairs from the state affairs, you'll be successful. And Europe was starting to be successful in this model. When they removed Christianity, when they removed religion from their state affairs, from their political affairs, they started to expand. They started to see great success. So now these Ottoman emperors, thinking that, you know what, maybe we should follow these people. They started to say that we're going to separate our church from our mosque and our religion, our deen, from the state as well. And they started to take up on this path. And slowly, over time, the religious courts were replaced by secular courts. The French financial system was adopted into the country. No longer a Sharia-based economic system, but a French system. The Ottoman identity was placed upon the people. So the people were told to be Ottoman rather than their own cultures. Remember how the Ottomans allowed cultures and religious minorities to have their own systems and places? Well, now the Ottomans were enforcing their identity upon all the religious minorities. And as you can imagine, what this did was that it started to cause revolts in the entire empire. People started to stand up that how come we don't have our freedom anymore? How come we cannot practice our religion and our systems the way that we used to? And slowly, one by one, the Ottoman Empire, with revolts and with the economy stagnating and with the religious decline, it started to fall one by one. And I would like to end this speech with a very beautiful narration, or a very wise narration. Umar bin Khattab, going back to the time of the righteous Khulafa. Umar bin Khattab said, he was traveling to Jerusalem with a famous Sahabi, a noble Sahabi, Abu Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah. He was traveling with him to Jerusalem. They came across a creek, and Umar bin Khattab had to lift up his thobe, his garment, and walk across that creek. So that was splashed on his clothes. Abu Ubaidah looks at him and he says that you're the Khalifa of the Muslims. When we reach that land, I feel that the people will not view you as being honorable. They'll view you as not having honor. Umar says to Abu Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah that, oh Abu Ubaidah, if it was anybody else other than you, I would have accepted the same. But knowing that you're saying it really disappoints me. And then Umar says that if we seek izzah, if we seek honor from anything other than Islam, then Allah will disgrace us. Allah has given us honor, the desert Arabs, through Islam. And if we seek this izzah and this honor through anything other than Islam, then Allah will disgrace us. My dear brothers and sisters, the biggest lesson that we can learn, the biggest lesson that we can take away, is that the Ottomans, in the economic concessions they made with the other nations, and with the separation of the church from the state, and all of these things, all of these concepts that tried to borrow from the outside world to bring success to them, eventually led to their decline. And just as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just as Rasulullah, and just as Umar have informed us that if you seek izzah from anything other than Islam, then Allah will humiliate you, the same way the Ottomans seek their honor and seek their izzah from the outside nations, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala disgrace them until they crumble around World War I.